Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to the Angelo Robles Podcast. I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Association. During COVID, I've been hosting practically daily amazing interviews that have been a lot of fun for me and my members. And to give a little bit of context to the discussions, I help global families and their family offices solve problems, procure positive future outcomes, and prepare for intergenerational necessity. It's vital for families and their family offices to understand their vulnerabilities and become more resilient so they can mitigate risk and prevail in times of crisis. My experience with some of the wealthiest families in the world has allowed me to distill best practices for discovering purpose, refining vision, governance structures, systems, processes, and culture that successful families and their safeguard family offices need in order to thrive. I help families create or reinvent their family office to be of institutional quality and highly adaptive. We're really excited about today's topic and guest. We're titling it, actually, after one of her blogs. It was such a good title, I couldn't resist it. 6 Mistakes Philanthropists Make During Crisis and What They Can Do Instead. It features Kris Putnam-Walkerly, author and founder of Putnam Consulting. She has a really stellar background. I'm going to read really just a small percentage of it. We're really excited to have her on. For over 20 years, she has advised top global philanthropists to transform their giving and catapult their impact. As a sought-after philanthropic advisor, expert, and award-winning author, Kris has helped hundreds of wealthy families, foundations, Fortune 500 companies, the Giving Pledge signatories, and wealth advisors to strategically influence and allocate over $500 million in grants and gifts. So really, it's a great pleasure. Kris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Angelo. It's great to be here.
Tremendous pleasure. And we're going to get into your latest book and some questions broadly, but I can't resist that title in terms of the 6 mistakes philanthropists make, especially during crisis, which I think safe to say we're all going through that now. So why don't we get right into it? And I did have a chance to go through them. I read the book, and really, again, it's exciting to have you on. Sequentially, why don't we start with that? If you want to frame why you did that and give it a little bit of context before you go into the first mistake, I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I guess the framing I'll do is just talking about the extent of giving in the past 6 and 7 months. I would say there's been more giving happening in the world than in the entire history of giving. Wow. Estimates are about, $14.2 billion have been allocated in charitable dollars to respond to COVID in the past 7 months, which is really remarkable, and that's worldwide. We're not just living through one crisis, we're living through multiple crises. So there's also been about 6 billion, that's billion with a B, allocated toward racial equity just in the past 4 months since the George Floyd murder back at the end of May. And that is more funding allocated toward racial equity and racial justice than in the past 11 years combined. So 6 billion in the past 4 months, more than the past 11 years combined. And of course, we've seen, tremendous giving from donor advised funds. For example, Schwab Charitable, they've seen over a 40% increase in giving in the first 6 months of this year as compared to the first 6 months of last year. So there's really been a remarkable level of generosity, I would say. But I wrote this article about 6 crisis mistakes that most philanthropists make because, we've been through many crises before, right? And there's lots of mistakes that show up again and again. And quite frankly, they even show up when we're not in a crisis. But I wanted to, really help wealthy families, family offices, and high wealth donors who want to be generous and want to give and want to make a difference, avoid some of these missteps so that they know what to do more effectively. So the first crisis mistake that most funders make, and many have made during this crisis, is to hide, or their instinct is to withdraw, right? Because when you're in a crisis, it can be very overwhelming. You can feel a lot of fear. And, this pandemic has been, I think, the first global crisis that has literally impacted every single human being on the planet. I mean, unless you've been living in a cave for the past, since February, you've been impacted by this pandemic somehow. And just, I mean, it's helpful to be wealthy to get through a crisis, but wealth doesn't block fear. It doesn't block feeling overwhelmed. And a lot of people have a tendency to retreat when they feel fearful. In fact, there was a study that came out from WealthX in July that indicated that about 10% of the world's billionaires had given in response to the crisis. But to me, what that says is that 90% hadn't, right? So there's a lot of wealthy individuals who have not responded that I think are kind of in hiding. And what I think donors need to do instead is engage. When despite feeling that fear or overwhelm of a crisis, imagine what your nonprofit partners are going through and what, the impact and the causes that you really care about. And so, very simply, one step any donor can take, any family can take, is to reach out to the nonprofit organizations that you have been supporting in the past and see how you can help. Ask how they're doing. What do you need? And even if you don't know the answers or you don't know your own financial situation at that moment to know exactly what you can give and what you can't, just reaching out and building that relationship, I think, is really helpful, because as donors, we have so much more to give than just wealth. We have connections and all kinds of things. So I think that's the number one crisis. The second one is related, and that is a lot of donors take a wait and see approach to a crisis. And so what that means is they say, the crisis happens, and that, it could be a pandemic, it could be a wildfire or an earthquake or whatever it is. And they'll say, well, we're going to wait and see till this whole thing shakes out, and then we'll decide how to give or if to give. And, one family foundation I know did this. I spoke to their executive director in March, right after, COVID hit in the US. And, they were about to embark on strategic planning, but their trustees said, hey, let's just wait and see how this whole pandemic thing shakes out. And we'll reconvene our foundation in September, like 7 months later, to see what's going on and how we want to respond. And to me, the challenge and the problem with that is you're really missing out on this tremendous opportunity to make a difference, to help others. And you're really wasting a lot of time and money, because in this case, that family had employees running their family philanthropy in their foundation. They were still paying those employees to really kind of not do anything or just sort of stay busy, but not busy on what was most important. They weren't willing to quickly assess, how do they want to make a difference, have an impact, and allocate their time and their resources toward that. Instead, they were just waiting. And to me, that's a tremendous mistake that most funders make. The third is too many funders stop building their philanthropic muscle. And by this, I mean, I think as philanthropists, it's really important that we experience an abundance mindset and really think about how do we need to become the best philanthropists that we can be in order to have the greatest impact on whatever issue or cause we care about. And too often, donors will have a scarcity mindset that really says, we don't deserve to invest in ourselves. And by investing in ourselves, I mean in your learning, in taking the time to building trusting relationships with nonprofit partners, in the advice that you need, in understanding what the needs are in your community, and figuring out the best way you can have an impact with your giving, right? And so I think all donors should be making those kinds of investments in themselves. They don't necessarily need to cost any money, but it's really thinking about, in a crisis, how do you put your own oxygen mask on first before you can help others? And how do you build up your philanthropic muscle and expertise and know-how so that you can be the smartest, funder you can be, and therefore have the greatest impact? And so I think, the mistake is that, is not investing in yourself, and really kind of this almost a misguided belief that, all the money needs to go help our nonprofit partners, which sounds noble, but I think is actually delusional, because again, it's okay to invest some time and resources in building your own capacity and knowledge as a donor. So again, I think that what to do instead is to do that, is to take time to make those investments. That could be something like, understanding community needs, It could be reaching out to your nonprofit partners, retaining a philanthropy advisor to help you create a giving plan, assessing the impact of your giving, so you know where you're falling short and where you might want to make some changes. I mean, a lot of donors right now are looking at, kind of recognizing racial inequality in ways they hadn't fully appreciated previously, and are taking the time to reflect on and take stock in their giving in the past. What kind of organizations have they supported? Who have they not supported? Are there things they could do differently to increase more equitable outcomes for all people? And what does that mean for their philanthropy? So those are all the kinds of things. They don't necessarily cost money, but it means improving how you give. Let me just pause there before I go into the other three, and Angelo, ask if you have any questions or any thoughts on any of that.
Well, those are great. I've been taking some notes as you're talking, and probably at the end of your 6, I'm going to have a series of questions for you, but you're in such a great flow. Why don't we continue with the remaining 3? Then I'll jump into a whole slew of questions.
Okay, that sounds perfect. All right, mistake number 4 that philanthropists make in a crisis is wanting to maintain control. And, when we're in a crisis, we all seek normalcy, right? We all want to go back to normal. And with that we all want some kind of feeling of control, right? And so, which is a normal reaction. But I think what happens too often is donors will kind of cling to misguided beliefs and practices that don't serve them or their grantees very well in the best of times, and really don't work very effectively in a time of crisis. So by this, I mean things like extensive application processes and hoops and hurdles that they force nonprofits to go through just to seek funding, or taking 6 months to make a funding decision, or deciding we only give once a year, and that's when the family meets in person, and so we can't make a decision until that happens, and we're not scheduled to do that until 6 months from now. Or on the back, or putting really tight restrictions on the funding. Yes, you can have a grant to run your after-school program, but we're not going to allow it to be used on the staff that are running the program. It can only be used on, materials or something. So these are all the kinds of mistakes that I think donors typically often make. And in a time of crisis, the mistake is, it's always, these are, I think, always mistakes, but the mistake is to cling to those. Because what nonprofits really need when, the rug is being pulled out from underneath them is very flexible funding, the allowance to be able to use that funding for whatever they think is the most important, trusting that nonprofit leader, that they know their community, they know the issue, they know the situation, let them navigate it, to be able to navigate around some of these challenges and also seize opportunities that might not have existed before, and to provide quick funding. And so what's been amazing, I think, in terms of trends in philanthropy since COVID hit has been the extent to which many families, family offices, donor and foundations have dropped a lot of these practices, kind of like hot potatoes. They've been holding tightly onto them for decades, and then suddenly they're like, okay, well, let's get the money out the door quickly. I know one family foundation that called all of its grantees to say, hey, we know that you're in crisis. There's an extra $10,000 check waiting for you whenever you want to pick it up. You don't even need to apply. Use the money for however you want. The Pritzker family, for example, through one branch of the Pritzker family, for example, through their Libra Foundation, they made a decision to double their grant-making budget for the year. So whatever amount they gave last year or were planning on giving this year, they're just automatically doubling it to give more in response, and created a fund specifically to support racial equity and racial justice, and are doing it by providing multi-year funding for what's called general operating support, which is just money to the nonprofit to use however they see fit. So I think, being more flexible and letting go of some of that control, I think, is actually beneficial. It's easier for the donor, quite frankly, and it's a lot easier for the nonprofit, because if you are supporting an organization that you really believe in, then I think it's perfectly fine and ideal to trust them to spend the money the way they think is most important. And, stay in touch with them and find out how it's going and what they need and how else you can help. Okay, the fifth mistake that donors make in a crisis is they divert all of their giving to crisis response, to that crisis, right? So, it's very easy to overreact, especially if you're living through a disaster or a pandemic of this nature and the economic repercussions. Of course, you want to help, but it can be very easy to rush and just allocate all of your funding to crisis response. But I think, instead of, shifting all your funding to infectious disease prevention, I think a donor needs to take a breath and think about, what issues did we care about before this crisis hit? What were our giving priorities? Who were the nonprofits we were supporting? What were the causes that we cared about? And stick with them. But of course, things have changed. So how can you be flexible with that funding? So let's say you supported early childhood education. Well, it might be during a pandemic that the buildings are closed and those kids are now at home. But that doesn't mean you stop supporting early childhood education because it's even more important now. You just might be doing it differently, right? You might be supporting those organizations to do some kind of online learning or support for those families who are trying to figure out, how do I stay at home with my kids, keep them learning, and somehow work. And then the sixth one is simply is only responding to the immediate needs. So, it's important to remember that in any crisis, there's usually 4 stages. There's the immediate response, there's the recovery, reform, and then resilience. So, and typically, most funding goes to the immediate response, right? Because, you see the horrible pictures on the news, or, you want to give and you want to make a difference and the need is so great, which is good. That's important. But also, I think as a donor, what you can do instead is to think long-term and think about, well, what can I allocate now to support and respond to the crisis and help people with immediate needs like shelter and food? But also, how do I think about, what's next? So if there was an earthquake and the school was destroyed, or, the roof caved in or whatnot, that school needs to be rebuilt. So you're not just making sure the kids are safe, you need to rebuild the school. And then, in the future, you might want to think about, well, how do we make sure that the school is, is earthquake safe when it's rebuilt? Or think about Hurricane Katrina, the dams broke, right? So not only do we need to rebuild the dams, but we need to think about, the other dams that didn't break, and how do we ensure that they're strong enough to withstand the next hurricane? And how do we think about other aspects of economic security and equity in that community so that all people are resilient and can respond to a crisis of any kind? So again, just to recap, the 6 crisis mistakes are hiding, waiting and seeing, refraining from building your philanthropic muscle, wanting to maintain control, diverting all of your charitable giving to the crisis, and only responding to immediate needs.
That was fantastic. And I loved reading it a couple of weeks ago, and coupled with your book, which we'll get into a little bit shortly in questions. Why don't we kind of mix that around? And again, for those live attendees, we do encourage your questions via the chat feature of Zoom. So I'm going to start with what's going to sound like a little shameless plug, which I'm not afraid to do, but it's going to segue very quickly into a question. I'm really excited. About a week ago, after courting them for a couple of months and talking to their strategic people, but being unsure if it was going to happen or not, that we received confirmation early this week that we're going to be having the head of the Walton Family Foundation on. Unfortunately, it's December. I do have a firm date and time. It's 100%. I don't have my calendar in front of me. But when I think of active family foundations of great scale in the US, I probably think of Gates, Bill and Melinda, of course, and the Walton Family Foundation. So to have what I think is one of the big 2, we're really, really excited about. So this is a subject we've been doing much, much more on lately. My question for you, and I've seen this in the work of the Walton Family Foundation, you mentioned the Pritzkers, utilizing philanthropy as a tool to engage the next and the rising generation. You want them to be stewards of their family brand and their wealth. And philanthropy may, especially at an earlier age, be the best teaching and engagement tool of being humility, of giving back. How would you suggest that the elders engage the rising generation through philanthropy? And they may need to understand that things that were of interest to the elders, let's randomly say the arts or supporting, Renaissance art, may not be what's going to be of interest to a younger generation, and how they should be receptive to that and how that all interplays.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I completely agree with you. I think one of the values of engaging in philanthropy for any wealthy family and for a family office is to have an opportunity to engage the next generation, because it really allows you as the donor to instill your family values, to just, to characterize and describe and share your family values with your children and your grandchildren and the rest of your family, however you define that, as well as kind of what your own personal mission and the purpose of your family and your family office is. And, I think we all want to ensure that our wealth continues over generations. And I think a lot of that has to do with clarity of mission, clear communications, and education and opportunities for engagement. Not just about philanthropy, that applies to, everything. But philanthropy gives you a really great opportunity to do that because it's a way that people can come together. One family is the Littman Canfor Family Foundation. So this is the family of Gojo Industries, the makers of Purell. And they came together to figure out, what's the why of their philanthropy? Why do they give? And they're a Jewish family, so they really believe in the Jewish, culture of giving and philanthropy. And they really, their why was really to create a multi-generational family around a culture of giving. And so they structured and as their family was growing older and beginning to move around the country and increasingly around the world, they wanted that opportunity. And so they actually brought their family together to say, how do we manifest that? And their solution was, or their approach was, to every 3 years, they pick a cause that they can agree upon as a family and spend 3 years together learning about that issue, if it's homelessness or whatever it is, and then picking organizations that they want to support and supporting them. And it's a 3-year time period. And after the 3 years is over, they move on to the next issue. But it's really an opportunity not just to give to important causes, but to learn together and build that connection and build that family culture of giving. But, let's say you're starting out, you don't really know how to approach it. I would just say a couple things. One is, as there's, if you know one family, you know one family. If you know one family office, you know one family office. And there's no one size fits all approach. But I would definitely recognize that while it's very important as the donor to share what causes you believe in, why you believe in them, why you have approached your giving in the ways that you have, to really be flexible and recognize that, just everything else probably in your family, like your kids have different opinions about things and they have their lives, they might live in their communities, and their children, the same thing. And so I think the importance of being flexible and allowing for different approaches. I think the my way or the highway approach to family philanthropy is not so effective. It might be effective while you're alive, but quite frankly, after you're gone, either your kids are resentful or they don't want to give and be part of it because they were frustrated that their voice never counted or whatever it is. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. I mean, take the Walton family that you've just described. That family has been very involved in the foundation, but they also in recent years have kind of have offshoots, different foundation and donor advised funds that their adult children have taken so that they can have more ownership over their own giving. So I think, there's all kinds of ways you can do this. You can allow as a family to come together and pick the issues you care about. You can allow different branches of the family to have pots of money, and they can focus on whatever issues and causes they care about. I was just talking to one family office leader yesterday, actually, and he was saying, as the matriarch of the family probably will pass away in the next decade, what they might want to do is convert their foundation into 3 separate donor advised funds, one for each branch of the family, and just allow them to not, argue and just give in ways that are meaningful to them. So I'd say have the conversations with your family, but allow for flexibility and be willing to listen to different approaches.
I kind of have asked that question to probably 6 or 7 philanthropic guests I've had on since June. I think that was the best answer to my mind that I heard. That was very comprehensive and great, always telling a story like the family behind Purell, because people could relate to that. And my members in relationships have heard me say this over and over and over and over, and they know it's true, that the destruction of a family far, far more is going to happen generation after generation internally than it is externally. And unifying the family around values and mission, but not being so rigid that the wealth creator from 50 years ago, we got to adhere exactly to what our mission statement was in 1959. That's so unrealistic, especially with this young generation. Maybe the later baby boomers and Generation X, we would fall on one, a little bit more in line, but the millennials and especially the Generation Z, and we could maybe say some negatives and scold them a little bit for that. But at the end of the day, they're incredibly opinionated and different. And we're going to get to some of the topics. You already covered 1 or 2 of them, but we're going to dive deeply into it relatively shortly. But mission, values, unifying the family, educating the next gen, rowing together as opposed to rowing apart, or absolutely perhaps breaking up the foundation and going the donor advised fund route, because then the family's not going to squabble. They're going to still be together. More broadly speaking, they're just electing to go in a different direction in their philanthropic interest, and that's okay. I don't know if my next question is kind of a combination of both, but I've heard this among some of my more affluent families and it's a bit of a sensitive subject. There is the issue of the haves and have-nots, and it's gotten more bifurcated over the years. Now, again, I know from what I do, I guess you could say I represent that top 1,000th of 1% per se, but they do understand that the vast majority are not them from a financial perspective. They each have 1 vote. So in theory, the ultra wealthy families in theory are not going to control from a political perspective. They're always going to lose out to the people that are more not them. So sometimes you see them utilize their philanthropy, no matter what their political affiliation, to kind of give back to the communities to make sure that people feel like they have a chance for education. So probably what are the basics? It's probably food, shelter, and then to have a better life, it's probably education, which is why I think you've seen Americans be among the best givers around the world. So how would you say, from that perspective, with the social issues that we have going on now, the bifurcation of wealth, that even if they may have motives to benefit their own family generation after generation, they do need to do something to give back that those that have less. And that's the whole value of being a philanthropist. And it may be a little bit for their own sustained interest, politically and otherwise, looking a decade or further in the future.
Well, right. I mean, yes, we do live in a very bifurcated world in this country also. And, I think, one thing this pandemic has shown us is that we are all, we're all impacted by this. None of us are immune. And it really makes no sense to have, part of the country and part of our citizens, live in abject poverty or have no access to the internet or no quality education or no access to healthcare. Like how could that possibly serve the wealthiest among us, right? Because we are really all in this world together. And not only should you care and not want that for people, and as a country, we really should be capable of taking care of all of our citizens. It's in everyone's best interest that everyone is thriving and succeeding. And so I think from a giving perspective, thinking about ways that you can give, two thoughts here. One is how do you best engage the people who are most impacted by the problem or the issue, like engaging them and coming up with the solutions to the problems, or even as a funder, how do you engage them in helping you think about your giving and what's most important to support? And so by that, I mean, very concretely, it can happen in a variety of ways. How you learn, who you're talking to when you're trying to learn about an issue, and making sure you're seeking either through research or a needs assessment or focus groups or conversations, talking to the people and the organizations working with them most impacted, so that, because the homeless person probably has a better understanding of what they need than somebody, living in one of 5 mansions, right? And so how do you think about not just using data and research and experts, but thinking about the people impacted by the problem as experts to engage? And a lot of, family foundations increasingly are finding ways to involve others in their giving. So that could be, maybe your board currently is all family members, but you could choose to bring on non-family community members and experts to your board of directors as a foundation, or involve others in helping you make funding decisions or figuring out what the priorities should be. So part of it is again, thinking about the book I wrote, Delusional Altruism, is all about helping funders think about how you give and how important the how is. And so the how can be much stronger if you involve the people you're trying to help in your giving decisions. And then I think secondly, how do you support change that is lasting and sustainable and transformational? So, it's one thing to make sure that people have shelter, and that's important. Any of us, living through a natural disaster could need shelter. But more importantly, I think in the long run is how do you make sure that people have the resources they need? So a homeless shelter is good, but the individual having mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, a job, a safe place to live, so that they can provide for themselves and their family and not need a shelter, is more important. And so really, how do you kind of fund and support some of those underlying issues so that you're solving problems and creating more lasting change rather than only supporting the Band-Aid solutions?
No, that's excellent. And, going back to that kind of comment question, your response to it, by having that tremendous bifurcation and not having people have hope, have food, have shelter, and have potential for education, and look at things more equitably, you potentially have what could lead to uprisings and chaos. And we are seeing a little bit of that in certain elements here in the US, which I never thought I would have seen before, with some of the protests and things that we're seeing that have gone on now week after week after week after week. And that, these are some of the issues that could lead to, terrible things. And families of great wealth, although they may not want to admit it, they know that. And that sometimes is one of the reasons why they both really need to be involved. I'm going to ask a question from reading it from Zoom from one of our listeners. It's a little bit long, then we'll get to your book and a couple of final questions. Here's the question from one of the viewer listeners. I'm surprised to not hear more about strategic philanthropy, using your example of supporting a school. Rather than give money to the school, one could use their donor advised fund to provide a 1 or 2% loan, which could save the school far more money than the donation. And since this is recoverable, it allows the donor to recycle the capital for future causes. Your comment, Kris?
I think that's she's making a great point. So a couple thoughts on that. One is, yes, there's an additional giving grants. You can also give, low interest loans or zero interest loans, often referred to as program related investments or mission related investments. So that, yes, in order to rebuild something, you loan money so that they have that capital that they need to rebuild. And then you get those funds back at low interest or zero interest, for example. It's a great tool for donors to use, and I highly recommend anyone consider that as an option. And also to the point about strategy, I mean, I really believe that, especially in these times of what feels like chaos and never ending, change, and the future is uncertain, it can feel very difficult to plan, right? To clarify what your strategy is. But I think more than ever, what donors, families, family offices should be doing is creating a plan that they can count on right now that is flexible and agile and responsive for the next 12 months. Because, one thing this crisis has taught us is that, it's pretty futile to spend a year creating a strategic plan, for example, that you think is going to last for 5 to 10 years because, the world just changed and it's going to be changing again. So I think it's far better to, kind of change your mindset and think about, rather than this uncertain future paralyzing us, let it free us. Think about, recalibrate your timeline. Think about the next 12 months. What kind of philanthropic family do we want to be a year from now? What kind of impact do we want to be having in the next 12 months? Where are we today? And what are the 2, 3, 4 most important things that we should focus on to get us from where we are today to where we want to be? And, base it upon the information you currently have available, and knowing that you can implement it immediately for as long as it makes sense, and change and course correct quickly as conditions change, because the conditions will change. Disruption and volatility are the status quo. The future is always uncertain. There is no new normal coming because there never was a normal, right? So just kind of change that mindset, accept that volatility is real, but don't let that stop you or paralyze you. Get a decision-making framework, a strategy, a plan for what you are trying to do, and just plan on being nimble and course correcting along the way so that you always have a framework for making decisions and know what your top priorities are, which is especially important, during a time of crisis.
Tell us a little bit about your most recent book, Delusional Altruism.
Yes, so the book is Delusional Altruism: Why Philanthropists Fail to Achieve Change and What They Can Do to Transform Their Giving. And, I wrote it because after advising donors, high net worth families for the past 20 years, I recognized that, they genuinely want to make a difference, be altruistic, change the world, but we're often getting in their own way and preventing themselves from having the impact that they were really seeking. And so I wrote the book to help them recognize how they're thwarting themselves, and then what they can do differently to have a more, transformational impact on whatever issue or cause it is that they care about, and often by transforming themselves and how they give.
And you hinted at it earlier, and part of it was covered during the 6 mistakes. But what do you think, if you had to narrow down to say 1 or 2, especially with the ultra affluent families that would have kind of a more formal family office, which probably means a foundation as well? What are some of the common mistakes that you think that family or their family office, if they're actively involved, mistakes they make when it comes to charitable giving?
Yeah. Well, one is having a scarcity mindset. So I think philanthropists like to save money, but they save it on all the wrong things. And so they don't invest in sufficiently in themselves, as I described before, and they don't invest sufficiently in their grantees. So typically, one common myth is that, overhead is bad for a nonprofit, right? But if you think about it, if you have a cause that you believe in and a nonprofit that you believe in, you know that they're doing really good work, don't you want them to have the most talented staff, excellent fundraising apparatus, great communications, a clear strategy, a terrific board, a well-oiled, financial management system in place, all these things, right? Well, of course you do. You want them to be the best, most effective nonprofit they could possibly be, so that they can have the greatest impact on whatever, community they're supporting. But too often, but our funding doesn't reflect that. So all of that stuff can cost money, right? You can't evaluate your effectiveness as a nonprofit without funds to cover the cost of the evaluation and the evaluators. And so, but all of that tends to get lumped into overhead, and then that somehow is bad, and only, 1% can go to overhead, and everything else has to go help, the people that are being served. It's not realistic. I'm just like as a family, you're paying a family office to, help your family survive and thrive across generations. It's important to invest in the nonprofits that you're supporting, just like you probably invested in your own business. If your wealth was generated through a business, you probably invested in technology and talent and retention, R&D, all of these things. Well, so does a nonprofit need to invest in those things. And so I think, by trying to save money, you're actually, hamstringing nonprofits. And even for yourself as a family, again, and a family office, I think too often family offices don't bring in outside expertise to help them with philanthropic giving, because most family office staff are not philanthropy experts. That's not, why you were brought on, and that's okay. But there are philanthropy experts that can help you as the family office professionals and for the family. And why not invest in kind of getting that additional expertise and advice?
No doubt about it. That's been my experience, and you're correct. And again, engaging the family, especially multiple generations, let's just say it could be good for both job security and longevity of a succession in the family office, which is one of the many reasons why, once the elder creator dies, the family office does not continue. And that happens on what you spoke about earlier on foundations, because it was too much of a dictatorship. It's very easy to do that. It's the simplest method of governance, how decisions are made. I just make the decisions, but it is guaranteed, especially with this younger generation, it's not going to work. They're going to go in a completely different direction. Related a little bit to that, speaking of the younger generation, let's call them millennials and Generation Z, which are gigantic generations in terms of population, especially Generation Z. They are just about coming into a position of voting power, of more say in matters in the workforce, all of that. And what's going to be important to them, my experience, and it doesn't matter what political affiliation that their elders may be in, it's going to be areas pertaining to equality, to social justice, the wildfire issues that you mentioned earlier. Yes, I do think that some of the things that President Trump brought up in the debate last night were accurate, that forestry management could help. That being said, you can't deny climate change issues. The world's temperatures are just hotter, and there's some negative things happening. These generations are very much into these issues. Here's what I'm hearing a little bit, or I'm reading through the lines. The elders are not engaging them enough. They're not giving them enough control of some of how we invest to make an impact in philanthropy, and their money and increased access to healthcare, they're living longer. You would think they would believe in governance, they would believe in greater engagement, and they would want to step a little bit away and enjoy, maybe their 70s or 80s. But a lot of them are holding on, and the children, the grandchildren, maybe the great-grandchildren are not feeling as listened to and engaged. We kind of covered some of this before, but how do you think there could go about and be a better in the middle to benefit both the elders and the rising generation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with fear. In fact, I think fear is such a problem in philanthropy. I devoted a whole chapter to it in my book, Delusional Altruism. I think, part of fear for the older generation, fear of, dying, like no one really wants to think about that. Fear of passing on your philanthropy, fear of losing control, fear of, what these issues are that my kids care about, fear of, all that's happening around, calls for racial justice and racial equity. But I would say two things. One is get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and dramatically increase your communication and, with your next generation. And so I think beginning to have these conversations now about what's meaningful to you, what's meaningful to them, and finding common ground, and recognizing that, if you genuinely want to make a difference on an issue, your understanding of it might not be accurate, right? And so be willing to learn and get a little uncomfortable and have your own worldviews challenged. I mean, thinking about, structural racism in this country, the reality is this country was built on racism, slavery, acquisition of land from Native Americans, right? And so that's just the reality, and that's continued to this day. And so now many people have are keenly aware of this all of the time because they experience it, and many people are, their eyes are being opened to what systemic and institutionalized racism means and the negative implications. And if you really want to make a difference and genuinely help communities, I think it's important to lean into that, because that's the reality. The reality is that people of color, Black people in this community, are disproportionately negatively impacted by all kinds of things. And so if you want to help people in your town, you want to think about, well, what's actually the underlying causes and problems, and how do we help rectify them? And so that might feel uncomfortable. That might feel like new information, and it kind of, you feel out of your element. But I would recommend to, put yourself on a learning journey as a donor, as a family, and to understand truly what's happening in your community and the ways that you can be helpful, and with your family, so that, you're learning together about some of these issues, and you're having conversations and discussing them. You're sharing your wisdom and your life experience, for the past, 60, 70, 80, 90 years of your life, and how you've come to the beliefs that you have, but being open to the beliefs and experiences of your children and their children as well.
No doubt about it. Probably the key thing you mentioned there that I always talk about in family governance issues and related to generation after generation sustaining wealth and legacy is a very simple word, yet somehow it always kind of falls apart, and that's communication. Even if you disagree, if you're able to be respectful and keep an open and consistent line of communication, I'm not going to say it'll all work out, but it kind of does. I've had on the world's leading experts on these issues that have studied family businesses, some of them going back over 150 years. Dennis Jaffe, James Grubman, both doctors, et cetera. And when you ask them just one word, that's it. It's just communication. Yet somehow that appears to be hard to do. And we're all responsible for that. So let's not always blame the elders. It's the younger generations or those in the middle as well. We all need to be responsible and communication doesn't always mean talking and saying your views, although that's a part of it. It means really actively listening. So that's something we could probably all do a bit of a better job on. Wearing a little bit of what my audience knows is a little bit of my libertarian hat for a second on what you said. Yes, I do think it's the responsibility of families of great success and how they could help give back to their communities and help everyone rise. Because we mentioned earlier, even from a political perspective and chaos in the country, in theory, that's going to be good. And if families don't do that, then the government is going to do it, which means significantly higher taxes. And does anyone think the government does things better? Some things they may, often they don't. It becomes a bureaucracy. So that's what happens when people aren't as active in philanthropy. It gets more government regulation and involvement, which usually, I'm not going to say all the time, but usually leads to greater inefficiencies, in my opinion. Building on what you said and what you said earlier, and I did not know this statistic, it caught me a little off guard. You mentioned WealthX, and most people should be familiar with WealthX. They're probably the most prominent global researcher on the ultra affluent. And another shameless plug, I've known the founder or co-founder, David Friedman, since they launched about the same time I created Family Office Association. And in 2 weeks, he will be a guest on the show. He is the founder, but he's no longer the current owner. He sold his interest in WealthX, but he's a very intriguing guy. But you did say, I may have it a little wrong, but that 90% of the world's billionaires, and again, US billionaires tend to be better in philanthropy, in my experience, than those around the world, but have not contributed or anything significantly, quote unquote, since the crisis. That's a little disturbing, partially for the reasons that I noted. If they don't, then governments will, which could include higher taxes, more regulation, more bureaucracy. If you could elaborate a little on that and how a plea to have those families be more active in their giving.
Yeah, here's the plea. Please give more. Because, I can understand at the beginning of this crisis when, the markets were taking a major hit, it was unclear what was happening. It's hard to know what what your wealth is and what you can give. But good Lord, if anyone can give, it's a billionaire. And, the needs are so dramatically great. I think it's really important. And I think it's also important to do it publicly if you can. So like, for example, Mackenzie Scott, the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, announced in July that she was giving $1.7 billion toward 116 organizations. She's also signed the Giving Pledge to give away most of her wealth in her lifetime. And it's estimated that she'll have to give away $3 to $4 billion a year just to keep up with her wealth growing to meet that pledge, which is really astounding. But nonetheless, she wrote about this in Medium as she announced this, and she had made kind of a last minute decision to be very public about it, about why she chose the organizations that she chose. She was very intentional about supporting racial justice, gender justice, LGBTQ equity issues, et cetera, as well as other issues, and really supporting organizations led by the people those organizations were serving. Because she wanted it, she believes that she recognized that not only does she have wealth, but she has, this spotlight and this ability to shine that light on the needs and help encourage other donors to give as well. And so I think, culturally, different parts of the world have different beliefs around being public in your giving. Like in the Netherlands, for example, it can come across as bragging if you talk about your wealth and how much you're giving away. Whereas here in this country, some people are bragging, yes, but I think mostly it's, because you're proud and you want to let others know and signal this is an important issue to support, or giving is important, or whatever it might be. And so I do think, that certainly is very important for all donors to really be stepping up.
Indeed. And maybe my final question, you mentioned a giving pledge. It does pop in my head. It's a great idea as opposed to waiting until death, better than nothing, but have you see the impact while you're living. I have no knowledge of any of this, but I'm just asking you as a legitimate, being curious question. And you answered it with Mr. Bezos's ex-wife probably needing to give away $3 or $4 billion a year, which is great. She's worth what, 100 billion or something like that. And I know it's just a pledge, it's not literally a contract. So of course, some people may change their mind. I've not heard as many people giving away during the lifetime now as much as maybe we would have expected. Is it natural for wealth creators? And I think it might be, when they come from a humble background. I've seen this, and they're worth $1 billion or $2 billion. And I know we're going to chuckle at this. I think they wonder, like, what happens if it kind of goes away? And what happens if I live to 120? They have not been actively giving, from my outside perspective, as much as I thought they may. And I wonder if some of it is a little bit of that psychological perspective.
Yeah, I think it really is kind of an emotional decision and a very personal decision. Some donors want to give in perpetuity, so they'll create a family foundation, for example, that will give away 5% of its assets every year, and with the right investment strategies, hopefully that will grow. And that could be for their own legacy. They want their family to always be involved in philanthropy, or they want their name, to continue. But it also could be because we don't know what the crisis of the next century is going to be. We want to make sure that there's philanthropic resources to support, the crisis we're going to have 20 years, 100 years from now. So there's different intentions and reasons why you might want to set up your giving to go into perpetuity. And then there's a growing trend of, giving all your wealth away and creating an exit strategy. So you're kind of spending down your assets, whatever your philanthropic assets are. Now, hopefully you would provide for yourself so that if you do live to 105, you're in good shape. But, whatever your philanthropic assets are going to be, intentionally spending that down so that, either because you believe the crises we're experiencing today are so great, the more money we can help solve those, maybe the quicker we can reduce them into the future, or because for kind of control reasons, you want to know how the money is spent, you want a hand in how that is being allocated. You don't want, your grandkids to be running your foundation in the future without your ability to have a hand in that. And so you intentionally spend down. And Atlantic Philanthropies is a good example of one, a massive foundation that just...
Yeah, that's a great one.
2 weeks ago or something shut their doors. So, they're both important options. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I just think it's important to get clear on what you want so that you can structure your strategy and your investments and your operations appropriately.
And Kris, for those that would have an interest in learning more about you and your organization, if you could both spell your name and provide how they could learn more and contact you.
Yes, thank you. So my name again is Kris Putnam-Walkerly, and my business is Putnam Consulting Group. And as I mentioned before, I was talking through those 6 mistakes. So if you want to learn more about those, I do have an article you can download. If you go to 6crisismistakes.com, you can download that article that goes into more detail about the mistakes funders make in a crisis and what they can do differently. Again, that's 6crisismistakes.com. And that will also put you on my website. So you can learn more about me there. And of course, my book is Delusional Altruism. There's a link to it there on the site. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all over the world, actually.
Excellent. And it was a great read. I really enjoyed it. Kris, it's been great to have you on the show. I'm going to give a little bit of a close, and like my open, it probably does take about a minute or two. Well, it's been great having Kris on. Again, since really June this summer, we've been covering philanthropic issues, probably more than I ever have in my 12, 13 years of FOA. And I highlighted some special guests upcoming, so we're very excited about that. These are very, very important issues, and some of them self-serving for the sustainability of the family. And the value that they provide in maintaining their legacy and their wealth, and wealth meaning more than just personal riches, but the wealth of their knowledge and how they could pass on and benefit, quote unquote, their communities and society. I think philanthropic is an amazing way to engage the next generation and to help teach, to help them be a steward. And even though I mention this all the time, I think I need to mention it all the time in philanthropic discussions, it still is severely underutilized and is, again, the secrets of the families. And I know many of them, and hopefully 1 or 2 will be on my show soon, the Rockefeller family and others, how they've sustained well over 3 generations often has been the commonality of next-gen stewardship, even when they may have different opinion than their elders, and philanthropy's been perhaps the most significant part of that. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles Podcast and founder and CEO of Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of wealth and their family offices. We provide a significant amount of original proprietary content. We're extremely active during COVID, literally doing 200 plus online digital events, I guess you could say, for our members. It's been exciting. We've had great guests on and look forward to that. We have a series of masterclasses and other value-added benefits like never before during COVID. It's been an engaging and an enticing time for us. I'm very active on social media. You could find me there. Our website is familyofficeassociation.com. And my email is angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. Kris, thanks for being such a great guest. Look forward to the next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.